Welcome to my channel. Here's today's eerie story. The Scottish Highlands stretched endlessly before them, a sprawling wilderness of craggy hills, misty glens, and dark forests. The four hunters, Callum, Duncan, Alec, and Liam, set out from the village early that morning, their spirits high as they ventured deeper into the wild lands in search of game. The village had been quiet of late, and the hunters longed for the thrill of the chase, the pride of returning home with fresh meat. The weather had been fair at first, the sun hanging low in the winter sky, casting long shadows on the rugged terrain. As they journeyed farther from the village, the land became more hostile, the ground uneven and treacherous. The thick pines swallowed the light, and soon the men found themselves wandering through dense woods that seemed to grow darker with every step. Callum, the eldest and most cautious, paused often, glancing around with a furrowed brow. "We should have stayed on the main trail. These woods, there's something about them. Feels wrong," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. Stop your worrying," Alec said, slapping Callum on the back. "We've hunted before. The game is better off the beaten path." But as the sun began to sink lower, casting a blood-red hue over the horizon, the hunters realized they had strayed too far. The familiar landmarks they relied on were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Duncan, the tallest and always the boldest, stopped and scratched his head. "Where are we?" "Lost," Callum replied, his voice grim. Alec, ever the optimist, shrugged. "I hope we can find somewhere to spend the night." And then, as if the land had heard their plea, they stumbled upon it. It stood there, hidden between the trees, a small, weather-beaten shieling. The roof sagged in places, the stones of the walls were moss-covered, and the windows, dark and empty, stared back like hollow eyes. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but it was shelter nonetheless. The men exchanged uneasy glances. "Better than sleeping out in the open," Liam muttered, though there was little conviction in his voice. The door creaked as Duncan pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. The floor was hard-packed dirt, scattered with dried leaves that crunched underfoot. An old hearth sat against one wall, the remnants of a long-dead fire lying cold in the grate. Wooden beams crossed the low ceiling, thick with cobwebs that fluttered in the draft. The place had clearly been deserted for years, if not longer. "Charming," Alec muttered, but no one laughed. Callum eyed the corners of the room, where the shadows clung thick and unmoving. His gut twisted with an unease he couldn't shake, but they had no other choice. Night was fast approaching, and the air outside had grown biting cold. They set to work. Duncan and Alec gathered what dry wood they could find for the fire, while Callum and Liam laid out their packs. Soon, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a dim, flickering light that barely reached the edges of the room. The warmth it provided was meager, but it was enough to ease the chill in their bones. The men sat close to the fire, eating their meager provisions and sipping from a flask of whiskey to fend off the cold. Their moods slowly lightened, the drink warming their blood and loosening their tongues. Liam, always the best singer among them, broke into a lively tune, a traditional Highland ballad, its rich tones filling the small hut. Duncan clapped along, and soon even Alec was on his feet, swaying with the rhythm. "We could do with some dancing partners," Duncan grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "A few bonny lasses to keep us company." Alec raised his flask in agreement. "Aye, some company would do us good on a night like this." Callum, however, said nothing. He felt it again, that prickling on the back of his neck, that sense of something watching them from the shadows. His hand drifted to the hilt of his knife, fingers brushing the cold steel. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the stone walls. The fire flickered low, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Then came the knock at the door. It was faint at first, barely audible over Liam's song and the crackling fire. A soft tapping, as if someone or something was gently rapping on the door. Callum stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Another knock, this time louder. The sound echoed through the cabin, cutting through the laughter and music. The men fell silent. Alec, emboldened by whiskey and bravado, staggered to his feet. "Must be travelers," he said with a grin, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. He moved to the door and flung it open without a second thought. 4 women stood in the doorway. They were breathtakingly beautiful, pale, ethereal, with long flowing hair that shimmered in the moonlight. Their dresses, deep green and impossibly elegant, rustled softly in the night breeze. They stepped into the cabin with a grace that was almost unnatural, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. The hunters were speechless. "Well, aren't you going to invite us in properly?" one of the women said, her voice soft as silk. Without hesitation, Duncan and Alex sprang to their feet, bowing and gesturing for the women to join them by the fire. 3 of them accepted, their movements fluid and otherworldly as they twirled into the room. They smiled at the men, inviting them to dance. The 4th woman, however, did not join the others. She drifted over to where Liam sat, her eyes locked on his as she slid gracefully beside him. Liam's song faltered and died on his lips, but he could not look away. The music, once lively, took on a slower, haunting tone. Callum, still by the fire, watched with growing dread as his friends were swept up in the dance. The women moved with an eerie elegance, their hands trailing along the men's shoulders and necks. There was something wrong, something terribly wrong. Then Callum saw it. Dark, wet drops began to form on the floor. Blood. It trickled down from Duncan and Alex's necks, unnoticed by either of them as they twirled in the arms of the beautiful women. The women's sharp nails had pierced their skin, and the men, lost in the trance, didn't even notice. Panic surged in Callum's chest. His mind raced back to the stories he had heard as a child. The Baobhan Sith, blood drinkers, hunters of men, creatures that appeared in the form of beautiful women to lure their prey. He turned to Liam, his mouth dry, but before he could speak, the woman next to Liam turned her gaze on him. Her eyes were like black pits, empty of anything human. "Stay," she whispered, her voice low and seductive. Callum bolted from his seat, his heart pounding. Without thinking, he sprinted for the door, bursting into the cold night air. Behind him, he heard a melodic voice calling his name, soft and inviting. "Callum, where are you going?" He didn't look back. His legs pumped beneath him as he raced toward the horses, tethered a short distance away. The wind howled in his ears, and the ground seemed to shift beneath him as if the very earth was trying to trip him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the horses. Desperately, he grabbed at their bridles, clinging to the cold iron as if it could protect him. He crouched low, hiding among the animals, his heart racing in his chest. The horses stirred but did not bolt, their breath visible in the cold night air. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, growing closer. Callum squeezed his eyes shut, praying that the iron would keep her away. He could hear her voice, sweet and tender, like a lover's whisper. "Callum, won't you dance with me?" She was so close now he could feel her presence. He held his breath, willing himself to remain still. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. Silence. The first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, cold blue. Callum opened his eyes cautiously. She was gone. Shaking, he rose to his feet and slowly made his way back to the cabin. The sight that awaited him inside was worse than anything he had imagined. His friends lay lifeless on the floor, their bodies pale and drained of blood. Their throats had been cut, their chests laid open, the blood pooling around them like a macabre offering to the night. Callum stood in the doorway, his breath shallow, his heart heavy with grief and terror. He knew the stories would never be believed. How could they be? But he also knew one thing for certain. The wilderness was no place for careless wishes. After the shock of it all, Callum somehow managed to hoist the bodies onto the backs of the horses. His hands trembled, but his instincts kicked in, guiding him through the dense woods until he stumbled upon the main trail. The sun was already beginning to sink, casting long, eerie shadows, but he pushed through, reaching the village just before nightfall. When the villagers saw him, bloodied and wide-eyed, leading the horses with their grim cargo, they gathered in silence, their faces pale with dread. As he recounted the harrowing events, their expressions turned from disbelief to horror. No one spoke for a long time afterward, but they all understood something unholy had been awakened in the wilderness that day. For Callum, that memory haunted him for the rest of his life, vivid and unrelenting. No matter how many years passed, the images of that cursed night never dulled. They stayed with him until his final breath, forever etched into his soul. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe. And remember, darkness is never far away. Until next time,